Tonight, we will discuss the fifth lesson of World of Kabbalah. This is high-level Kabbalah. We're going to get even higher tonight than we discussed last week. I am somewhat watering down some of the terms, some of the ideas, but rest assured, if you really want high-level Kabbalah in the Kabbalistic terms, you can send me a link, an email after the class, and I can send you links to the actual literal words of the Kabbalah from the Zohar discussing these topics. Tonight, we will discuss perhaps the most discussed Kabbalistic concept in all of Kabbalah. So Seder Hishtalshelut, which is the order, the chain of events, the order of devolution that we are in general discussing today, is the greatest idea that's discussed throughout Kabbalah of the Seder Hishtalshelut or chain of events. Perhaps the most important moment of this chain of events on how we come into existence from God's infinite light is going to be what we are discussing tonight in lesson 5. So we are on page 141. Now they say the story of a guy goes on a date. It's his first date, and they go, I don't know, walking on the beach, and they're talking. And this guy doesn't stop talking. He's talking. Perhaps he's a rabbi in another life. He doesn't stop talking. And after about 3 hours of talking about himself, he turns to this young woman and he says, all right, I've spoken a lot. Enough of me talking. Why don't you tell me what you think about me? Tonight, we will discuss a little bit about ego and perhaps a lot about ego. Good evening. Welcome. Perhaps a lot about ego. But that's what the overarching topic that we will discuss today. And we'll begin with a question. It's a question we can all ask ourselves. And perhaps we ask ourselves this question regularly, either consciously or subconsciously, but we do ask ourselves this question. And the question is, did we ever encounter so much adversity, so many challenges in one area that we gave up? And you can think back. You don't have to answer. You can think back, it's for yourself, but think of a time, whether it was, in elementary, it happens all the time. As a kid, it happens all the time. You're frustrated, you try to build that Lego set, it doesn't go, you give up on it, and you move on to something else, right? It happens, we do give up on certain things. And it's not just little things or little projects. Sometimes we have big projects. Sometimes we have our dream job. Sometimes we have a relationship that we're trying to strengthen. And we're hitting so many snags along the way, so many challenges, so many obstacles. And how do we persevere? How do we not crumble in the face of adversity? And really, that's going to be the overarching question that we're going to discuss today. And we will get the answer from Kabbalah. Before we get into tonight's class, let me just recap what we discussed. So if you remember, we have our trusty little map here. Should have had a big printout right here. Easier, to point with the stick, make me feel like a teacher or a or an eyeglasses of optometrist. The story, this guy comes to the optometrist and he's sitting down and he unfurls that entire sign, and it's got like that big E on the top, and then the FG, and then it's got the smaller letters, and it's got like the WXCZ all the way on the bottom. And this young fellow, he's a new immigrant from Poland, and he arrives to get his optometry test, and the doctor is showing him, so can you read this? E. And he's going through the whole thing, finally comes to that bottom line where it's got the small letters WEXCZ, and the doctor says, do you know what this says? And the guy says, do I know what that says? I know the guy. In Polish, there's WCZE, lots of that in names. Wojcicki. Either way, so we have our trusty little map here. And in this map, we've been going through really from the top where we have the infinite light. We'll get to that next week, why it's on the top if we already discussed it here. But the idea, where am I? Here we go, the order of devolution. So last week we discussed the tremendous light and vessels that are supposed to mix together the world of Torah, the world of chaos, where they haven't really figured it out, and that's where our animal soul stems from, and how to reconcile the animal soul with the divine soul, the idea that we are made up of two souls. That was the mirror in the human soul. Following that, we explained that there is the Ein Sof, right? The Ein Sof from which comes the world of emanation. That's what we explained in lesson 3, the world of emanation, where we have those 10 divine energies begin to form in the world of emanation. So they're still within the divine, but it's now somewhat beginning that stamp, beginning that imprint, so to speak, within God, that godliness aspect of God, to be able to give room for others. Those are the 10 Sefirot, and the mirror image is our personalities, where we come from, where our soul comes from. Following that, we explain that went into, in lesson 1, the 3 worlds of creation, formation, and the world of action, where suddenly there's now this creation of other, and that is what enabled the creation of us in this physical world. And we explained all these ideas at great length. Perhaps that's why now I'm giving a short version of 60 seconds versus the classes that were an hour and a half each. So that's really an overview. What we're going to discuss today is something that we haven't discussed until now. It's a glaring omission that I was expecting someone to ask, but I'm still waiting. If anyone still wants to ask, it's a glaring omission that's a key component of this entire matter. And the question, it really is like this. We have this infinite light of the divine. How on earth does something infinite suddenly become finite? How can it go from something so powerful to something so weak, something so limited, something so finite? What was that moment of change that suddenly it's able to emanate from within, that God is able to emanate something so limited, something so confined? And I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. I drive with my kids all the time. We're constantly in the car. I drive more in a day here in California than I did growing up, probably a whole month. In New York, you walk everywhere. I walk to school, I walk to shul, I walk to the market. Everything's within walking distance. And by the way, walking distance in New York for a fifth grader is anything under a half-hour walk. If it's under a half-hour walk, anything from second grade upward is considered walking distance. I came to California, you're not even allowed to walk around the corner. You got to take the car. So I drive my kids all over the place. We drive to school, we drive to the store, right? And every once in a while, or quite often, you see the electrical wires high up. In New York, another difference, no electrical wires on top of the streets. There's no wires. Why? I don't know. I'm going to make it up because that's what I like doing. I'm going to make it up. I don't know why, but my guess is because it gets too cold, it gets too windy. The wires can fall, I'm not sure, but either way, there's no wires. Most of the wires are below ground. In California, most of the wires are above ground. You see those wires, you see those things, and every once in a while, you notice a garbage can on top of those wooden poles. That garbage can is what causes that outage to your house every couple of months, every few months, every 6 months, every 8 months. There's suddenly a blackout. A balloon hit the wire, right? Those terrible balloons, one of the worst things in society. We got to get rid of them, right? Those balloons hit the wire, and suddenly what happens? The transformer blows. They got to change the garbage can. It happened in, I was staying by my in-laws in, I think it was in July, and we had a transformer blow, and for 14 hours, we were without electricity. What's a transformer? A transformer has to do something magnificent. It's got to take the voltage that's in those wires, which is some 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 volts of electricity, and it's got to transform those 5,000 volts into 120 volts, right? So that's it, right? 110, 220, what are we? 110. It's got to change it to 110 volts. Why? Because now, if 110 volts comes to your outlet, you can plug in your coffee machine, and now you can have a good coffee, right? You can plug in your refrigerator, and you got cold food. What happens if there was no transformer? You'd have a big problem. Houses would be going up in flames. 3,000 amps or 3,000 volts is way too much for a house to contain. So in order for 3,000 volts to suddenly go into 110 volts, you can't just have smaller wires, the wire getting smaller and smaller and smaller. You need a transformer that takes that energy and transforms it into a lower level of energy. Now, I'm not an electrician, so I don't really know how the transformer works. It has something to do with AC and DC power. A transformer, I think, is only alternating current, so it's AC, and it's got to have coils and it connects. And either way, I'm not an electrician. I don't know. We need Amos for that, for those of you who know. Amos, electrician. Perhaps he can explain this. But either way, what's the idea? There's the what, and the what is it's changing it from 4,000 volts to the 110 volts. And then there's the why. The why and the how, well, the why is because if it didn't go, it's going to just burn the house. And the how is the transformer. That is the how. How the mechanism works, we don't know. The question is, when it comes to the divine energy, we have this immense, infinite light that if it would go into this world, the world would cease to exist. So we know the why, and we know the what. We know that the light is transferred from the infinite light into, right, the vessels, and from the vessels it goes to the world of emanation. From the world of emanation, it goes to the world of creation, formation, action. So we know the what, we know the how, we know the why, but we don't know the how. How is that possible? How does God take his infinite light and move it into something so far? This is what's called, and this is an important word in Kabbalah, perhaps one of the most discussed words and terms in Kabbalah. This is called Tzimtzum. So one of my little cousins says, he heard his father studying Kabbalistic texts, and he wanted to know why his father kept on saying Simpson. But this is different. This is not Tzimis. It's the same tz, right? They say, what is 60 minutes and Jewish grandmothers have in common? I think I said it last week, did I? What does 60 minutes and bubbies have in common? You know what 60 minutes is? Everyone knows, right? What do they have in common? So this is the Tzimis, but it's not Tzimis, it's called Tzimtzum. What does Tzimtzum mean? Tzimtzum means contraction. That's what the literal word means, contraction. That is the how of the what and why that we discussed the prior few weeks. That is the how God takes his infinite light and is able to transform it into the 10 energies and then further devolving until it reaches this physical limited world. There's got to be, with every evolution and devolution, there's got to be that moment of change. That's what we're discussing now. Perhaps you can say that it's something like in American history, right? If you discuss American history from the 18th century, from the 15th, 16th, 17th century, right? You're discussing one aspect of American history. Now you're discussing from the end of the 18th to 19th century, right? It's an entirely different existence of America. What changed? The American Revolution, right? 1776. We're not going to discuss what day. We'll let the historians discuss when exactly it was signed, when exactly it was discussed, the $2 bills, lots of fun that we had, right, in school. But what was it? It was the American Revolution, right? That's what changed America from the mid 18th century to the end of the 18th century. What was the trigger that caused the American Revolution? It was brewing, there was excitement, there was the Tea Party, there was lots going on, right? Brewing, tea. What was that moment? It was the shot heard around the world. Not, right, what was his name? Not the baseball, was it? Who was he, right? 1952, 62, what was it? Ralph? Either way, not the shot heard around the world of the baseball bat, the World Series. We're talking about the shot heard around the world, wherever it was shot, that first shot that started the American Revolution, right? That was the moment that the tinderbox exploded. That was the moment that everything went up in flames, literally, and now it changed reality. What was that moment, that shot heard around the world, that moment, that catalyst that changed everything? That is the Tzimtzum. Let's have a look in text 1. Text one on page, where are we? Here we are, page 143. Text one on page 143. This is a real Kabbalistic text. It's a little tough to understand, but we'll go through it slowly. Lots of Kabbalistic ideas, and as we explained many times, we can't take Kabbalah at face value, right? We're not Amelia Bedelia. So if we say put out the lights, right? Anyone know Amelia Bedelia? Kids' books? Amelia Bedelia, right? The kids' books, you know what I'm talking about? She does a lot of very literal things, right? I think I've mentioned her in the past. One of my favorite books. So what does she do? She does a lot of literal things, and really it's what kids do, right? Until they understand that we're talking about figurative ideas and we're not talking about literal. So for the example that's classically given is it's a great picture of a clothesline outside covered in light bulbs because the owner of the house told her she's a maid at the home, and the owner of the house tells her to put out the lights. So she literally unscrews the light bulbs and puts them out, right? Obviously, we're not Amelia Bedelia. When it comes to Kabbalah, we don't take things at face value. We have to understand the depth that's being expressed in the text. She's a Chelmite. There we go. Okay. So, thank you. Bobby Thompson and Ralph Branca, New York Giants versus Brooklyn Dodgers. Thank you. The two Brooklyn teams, and we have a Los Angeles connection there. If I'm not mistaken, Ralph Branca is Jewish. And he even wrapped tefillin recently with a few, about 10 years ago, with a few Chabad boys who were going, asking people if they're Jewish, if I remember correctly. But Bobby Thompson and Ralph Branca, thank you, Shmuel. All right. So not that shot heard around the world, a different one. We're talking about this, the Tzimtzum. So text one, page 143, we will read through it slowly. Bear with me. And if you're confused, that's wonderful, because I was as well the first time I studied this text. This text is from world's foremost Kabbalist. Who was the world's foremost Kabbalist throughout all of history? There we go, Rabbi Yitzchak Luria. Yitzchak Luria is also known as the Arizal. Very good. The Arizal. He did not transcribe any of his teachings. He did not write anything. He actually passed quite early. If I'm not mistaken, he was 36 years old. But he had a prime student who was his disciple, his successor. His name was Rabbi Chaim Vital. And Rabbi Chaim Vital transcribed all of his master's teachings. And that's how we have all his teachings. And he was perhaps world's most prominent and most famous Kabbalist. So text one, here's this Kabbalistic text, which is one of the most important Kabbalistic texts in all of Kabbalah. Text one. Before Atzilut was emanated, and before the creations were created, a simple divine light filled all of reality. It had no aspect of beginning or end. It is called Or Ein Sof, the infinite light. Right? Till this point, we got it, I think. We got it? Which is what we've been speaking about really in the past, the infinite light. There's no beginning, there's no end. We discussed 2 weeks ago that it's generally called without an end, but it has no beginning as well. When it arose in his will, God's will, to create the worlds and to emanate Atzilut, the world of emanation, those divine energies, he contracted his finite light and an empty space emerged. Right? So he contracted his infinite light and an empty space emerged. We'll explain that in a moment. He then projected downward a single straight line from his circular light, devolving into this empty space. Within this empty space, he emanated, created, fashioned, and made all worlds. Now, is your mind going in circles right now? A little bit, right? Now, what the Arizal is explaining here is exactly what we just said. What was in the beginning? The beginning was a simple divine light that filled all of reality, right? What was that divine light? It had no beginning, it had no end, it's infinite. What's something that has no beginning, has no end? A symbol of infinity, a circle. Why it's an 8 and not a circle is beyond me. Why is a symbol of infinity an 8? I don't know. But a circle is a symbol of infinity, right? Because it has no beginning, it has no end. So when we're talking about God, when we say God had a circular light, we obviously don't mean a literal circle. We mean there was an infinite light like a circle, right? So now God has the so-called problem. He's got to take this infinite light, that's a circle, and now make it into something which is defined. It's got a beginning, it's got an end, it's got sides, it's something that is limited. In other words, a line. A line doesn't mean there was an actual line. It's something which is symbolized by a line. What is a line? There's a top and a bottom, a beginning and an end. It's got a beginning and an end. It's finite. So in order for God to take his infinite light and be able to create something which is finite, God had to make a tzimtzum, a contraction, contract his light. What does it mean, contract his light? What does it mean when we say that God contracted his infinite light and an empty space emerged?
Well, it's everywhere.
This contraction, very good. How can it be that there's a space? Joan asked a question. How can it be there's an empty space if the infinite light is everywhere? This contraction, 8 is really Mobius strip with no edge. Infinite line does not come to an edge or an end. Okay, I guess I have to brush up on my calculus algebra. So Joan asked a question, how can it be an empty space if there's nothing empty from the infinite light? By definition, the infinite light is everywhere, and the infinite light, as we explained, it's even here in this room, is just contract. So what is the idea of contraction? The idea of contraction is a concealment. Right? They say the story of 3 cadets studying to become LAPD officers, detectives. And their teacher shows them a side picture of a side profile. And he says, tell me, if this guy was on the run and you had to describe him, how would you describe him? So the first guy says, well, I'd say he only has one eye. And the teacher says, well, obviously he's only got one eye. It's a side profile. He's only going to have one eye. You got to come up with something better. And he goes to the second cadet and he says, so tell me what's something on this picture that you'd be able to describe this fellow. And he says, well, he's got one ear. He says, no, the same thing. It's a side profile. Obviously, he's got no ear. He's got only one ear because it's a side profile picture. Finally, he goes to the third guy and he says, so how would you describe this guy if you had to point him out, if you had to describe him? So the third guy says, he has contact lenses. Now, the detective doesn't know. He looks at the pictures. Now, how can the guy possibly know if he has contact lenses? Let me go check this guy's file. He checks the guy's file, and he comes back 20 minutes later. He says, yes, this guy has contact lenses. That is a great, great pointer. How do you know that this guy has contact lenses? And the guy says, well, if he only has one ear and one eye, he can't possibly wear glasses. So just because you don't see something doesn't mean it isn't there. What God did with his contraction, he didn't remove his infinite light, he concealed his infinite light. Once there was a concealment of the infinite light that enabled God to now reveal whatever degree of his light that he wanted to reveal. What do I mean by that? Or perhaps we'll return to an example, a metaphor we gave in the past a number of times, and that'll hopefully give us a little more understanding of this concept. Albert Einstein, back to him, our good friend Al, right? What do we explain? He's got this wonderful idea of the theory of relativity, right? Which we said was symbolic of the infinite light. It's vast. Imagine it was an infinite idea. And perhaps it is because it's within the world that God created. It's God's wisdom, it's God's creations, and if God's infinite, then. But for argument's sake, let's say that his idea of theory of relativity. Did I say this joke about relativity? There's two Jews sitting on a park bench in Warsaw, 1929, 1930, and they're discussing, did you hear this? This professor, Albert Einstein, he came up with a wonderful idea called the theory of relativity, and it's life-changing. And Yankel turns to Chaim and says, what's life-changing about it? What's the theory of relativity? He says, everything is relative. So what do you mean by that? He says, look, if someone has 2 hairs, is that a lot or a little? He says, well, it's all relative. If it's on his head, 2 hairs is very few. If it's in his suit, 2 hairs is way too many. It's all relative. So when it comes to Albert Einstein discussing theory of relativity, right? And he wants to explain it to 4th graders. What does he got to do? What did we say? He simplifies. He finds an idea within theory of relativity. He doesn't want to talk about his upbringing. He doesn't want to talk about something else. It wants to be something which is connected to the theory of relativity. So he goes ahead and he finds one idea and he expresses it in a childlike manner to these kids so they're able to comprehend this idea. Did they get the entire idea? No. Did he forget the entire idea? No. He still has it in his mind. What did he do? He did a tzimtzum. He did a contraction, which was a concealment of his immense mind. He concealed it entirely. He put it in a corner, and he thought long and hard, now that I'm not teaching this entire concept to these 4th graders, what is one minor idea within the theory of relativity that it's part of the theory, but it is a minor aspect of it that I can now impart to these students? That concept, that action of him putting this idea, the entire theory of relativity, which if he teach it to these students, right, he put their minds in circles. And if he wants to give them a line, give them one thing that they can grasp onto, one thing that they can connect with, one thing that's on their level, that's limited, that's got a beginning and an end, a side, a left side, a right side, a concept that they can grasp on their level, he's got to take those circles. He's got to take that infinite idea of theory of relativity, put it on the back burner, conceal it, think of what's one minor implication within the theory of relativity, and impart that to the students on their level. That is what God did with his infinite light. God concealed, he didn't remove it. He concealed his infinite light. It's still there. We can no longer see it. The worlds, these divine realms that we discussed earlier, can no longer perceive it. And now God was able to reveal a more contracted, a more finite aspect. Because remember, finity, right, finitude, was within God. Because if God is only infinite and not finite, you're limiting God. That itself is an expression of finitude. Because if you say God has one thing and doesn't have the other, you're limiting God. So in order for God to be able to express that aspect of finitude, which is already within God, God has to conceal all of the divine light in order to be able to reveal the finite aspect. We good? We got that? So that is the shot heard around the world. That is that moment, that is that level of the divine where it goes from infinite light to finite, the potential for finitude. Atzilut, the world of emanation.
All these emanations are non-physical.
Correct. So Joan is asking about the emanations that we see on the map of the 10 energies are not physical, but they're finite. So the divine energies, Joan is asking, are they finite or not? So being finite doesn't necessarily mean being physical. Being finite means they're limited, they have a beginning, they have an end. these 10 attributes, what we termed as godliness, is an expression of divine, but it's the beginning of the other. And so it has some form of finitude. It's got a beginning. And so it isn't the full expression of the divine light, it's the contracted divine light. Now, to be sure, there were more contractions throughout all of the chain of events. These contractions happened multiple times. What we're discussing today is the initial contraction, that first moment that enabled this entire process to begin. Let's have a look on page 147, text 3. This is, as we mentioned earlier, in the words of the Alter Rebbe. The Tzimtzum does not mean that God's infinite lights departed, God forbid, as Joan asked, for in truth there is no place devoid of him. This principle is also expressed in the Midrash. Why did God choose to reveal himself to Moses from within a thorn bush? Right, you're familiar with the story? Moses is running and he's chasing after a sheep and he sees the fire emanating from a thorn bush. Why did God choose a thorn bush? To teach that there is no place devoid of God's presence, even a thorn bush. Instead, and this is the important point of this text, in this context, the meaning of Tzimtzum is that Ein Sof, the infinite light, went from a state of revelation to one of concealment without actually departing at all. Right? Back to the policeman, just because you don't see something doesn't mean it's not there. So what does the Tzimtzum do? The divine light was revealed, the infinite divine light was revealed, God concealed it, and now God projected a straight line, which is figurative of and symbolic of a finite possibility, a finite, what's the word I'm looking for? Possibility, a finite ability within his aspect of creation. This idea, where are we? This idea is expressed in many areas of life. It has a parallel in the human soul, but we're going to focus more not just on the parallel of the human soul, but more on an actionable item, because that's really what Kabbalah is about. It's not so much about the abstract study of Kabbalah as much as it is the practical application of it. So what is the practical application of this Tzimtzum? As you can see, this first concealment perhaps has no parallel in the human soul, which is why it's blank on the on the human soul side, because ultimately we're not infinite. We'll talk more about that next week. But the ideas that we will discuss today will be ideas that we can glean in our day-to-day interactions with other people. Where do we see the Tzimtzum in our lives? We all know people who are self-absorbed, right? The story of the boy and girl going on a date, right? Enough about me. Now you tell me what you think about me. We all know people who think about themselves. And it doesn't necessarily have to be consciously talking about themselves. But there's always, we're in a meeting and there's one person who's hogging that meeting. They're talking the entire time. They have their ideas to share, and that's all they want to hear. And if you don't accept their ideas, then you're offending them, right? Who how do they say now? Who's offended today, right? In society, we have to be careful. Who are we offending today just by saying anything, right? So what's this idea of being offended? What's this idea of hogging the meeting room? It's not just hogging the meeting. It happens in relationships. It happens in it happens by school children. It happens by adults, right? People who take everything from themselves. So we're talking about time, energy, money, whatever it may be. What we're talking about here is a tremendous ego. Perhaps we can say it's someone who's trying to emulate the infinite light. I'm everywhere. I'm everything. Everything is mine. Everything's about me. What's the idea of the Tzimtzum? The idea of Tzimtzum is in our service of God. The idea of Tzimtzum is let's contract ourselves, conceal ourselves. Don't remove ourselves. We're still there. We're still at the table, but it's not all about me. There's other people in the room. Give space for other people. There's obvious examples, and then there's subtle examples, each in our own lives, in our own areas, or let's think about other people, right? Other people, they take up a lot of the room, literally or figuratively. And then there's people who are able to subdue themselves. They're not disappearing, they're concealing themselves. Obviously not entirely, right? Just like there was a Tzimtzum, now there can be a finite light that comes from it. There can be an expression of yourself, but it's not all about oneself. Make room for others. And there's a powerful story that expresses this idea in text 6a on page 156. Sorry, we're skipping around a little bit. Page 156. This is a Hasidic discourse from the previous Rebbe, the Rebbe's father-in-law, and he expresses this idea beautifully by sharing a story that occurred with his grandfather. Those who are self-obsessed and narcissistic become engrossed in their desires and wishes and completely forget about God. Similarly, their self-obsession precludes loving others. Their self-love generates divisiveness because it doesn't allow them to tolerate others. They think that whatever someone else says or does is directed against them. And here's the story. There was an incident that well illustrates this point. A fellow who happened to be a tremendous scholar and well-versed in Torah once had a private audience with my great-grandfather, Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Lubavitch. Rebbe, he complained, the others are stepping all over me in the study hall. They do not appreciate what I have to say. They do not behave properly toward me, and they do almost the exact opposite of my opinion. The Holy Rebbe replied, your ego expands throughout the entire study hall. Whenever anyone steps, it's bound to be on you. What's the idea he's expressing? If one expresses themselves all over, they're going to get offended. If one expresses themselves all over, they're going to feel like everyone is stepping upon them. Don't express oneself all over, and you won't be stepped upon. Don't be that overbearing ego. And we see that problem, as I mentioned, in many, many areas. And the previous Rebbe expresses that this idea stems from self-love, which is natural, which is healthy, but it's healthy to a degree. Ego doesn't give space for others. When you have a room and it's filled with a balloon, there's no space for anyone else. When someone's ego is blown out of proportion. So what does this Kabbalistic idea teach us? We have to work on enhancing our character to a level of loss of ego, not entirely, but lose our ego that we shouldn't be spreading ourselves all over, so much so that wherever someone steps, they're stepping on us. And this idea is not only about terrible people or egomaniacs. The individual in the story that's related here was a very holy individual. He was a great Torah scholar. He spent his entire day studying Torah, connecting with God, but what he was missing was all about him. It wasn't so much about the Torah, which really leads us into the second point. And that is that just as with regard to life, when there's the loss of ego, we now have space for others and their opinions, and that benefits relationships, any type of relationships. It's not so much about us, it's about them. And then there's space for them, and then the relationship is a much better one. This idea is with our relationship with the divine as well. And with the divine, it's actually it takes it a step further. It's a relationship and one of reciprocation. What do I mean, one of reciprocation? The verse actually employs this term. The verse says, I believe it's in Ecclesiastes. Not sure. I believe it's in Ecclesiastes, but the verse says, "Kamayim aponim al aponim ken leva adam ala adam." What happens when you look into water? You see your own reflection. So if you smile, the water will smile back to you, right? A mirror. The olden days, they had water, right? If you look into the water, it's going to smile back to you. So too, one's heart to another one. When we have strong feelings for someone else, they'll have reciprocal feelings. Is that the word? I think so, right? So when it comes to God, this verse is talking about God as well. When we smile, God will smile back to us. When God smiles to us, we smile back to God. It's only right. So too, what happens over here? God took his divine light, his immense, infinite divine light. God was spread all over. And what did God do? He contracted his light. He concealed his light for what purpose? To create you and I. So to speak, what did God do? He put himself aside in order to create us. If God can do that, then we can surely put ourselves aside for God. We can reciprocate in kind. What does that mean? Each one of us in our own areas of life, right? What happens when it comes to putting on tefillin every day? It's not who I am. It's not what I do. I'm not there yet. I'm not comfortable. It's all about I, right? Joke last week, 2 weeks ago, right? There's no I in marriage. You used it? There we go. There's no I in marriage, right? What do? I don't correct his spelling, right? And say the American, what's the problem with our generation? Everything's I. iPhone, iPad, right? Everything's I. It's all about me. Finally, they create something called the we. And what is it? It's got two I's, right? It's all about I. So what happens? That's how they spell the game console called we. It says W-I-I. So what's the issue? The issue is there's no space for God. If we put ourselves aside, we reciprocate in kind. God put himself aside, his infinite light, put it aside. If we put ourselves somewhat aside and say, you know what? I may not be holding it there, but you know, it's not all about me. Let me reciprocate in kind. It's for God. Let me let God into my life. Someone once asked the great Kutzker Rebbe, who's famous for his witticisms, very smart, second generation Hasidic Rebbe in the beginning of the 19th century, end of the 18th, beginning of 19th. And they asked him, he said, where is God? Where is God? What were they expecting him to answer? Everywhere, right? What did he answer? Wherever you let him in. Obviously, speaking figuratively, of course, God is everywhere. But the idea is, if our ego is filling the room, there's no space for God either. What does ego stand for? Edging God out. And so that's the idea where we should reciprocate in kind. Let's have a look in text 7 on page 159. Reciprocation is a natural response. God set aside, figuratively speaking, his great infinite light and concealed it. He did this. Why did he do this? Due to his great love for us, to raise us up to him. For love induces one to restrict oneself for another, right? What happens when you love someone else? You make space for them. That's true love. When we reflect on this deeply, our souls will spontaneously be ignited to reciprocate. We will feel motivated to forsake everything in order to cleave to him. It's only the natural thing to do. To go ahead and to reciprocate in kind. So what's the first message we take out from the Tzimtzum? The first message we take is taming our ego. The first idea is that we have to work on ourselves to not take up the room. Because if you spread yourself all over the room, obviously wherever anyone's going to go is going to trample. And to reciprocate in kind to God's removing or concealment of himself, because of his love for us, he made space for us, so to speak. So too, we should make that space for God. It's only natural. Yes?
In trying to improve ourselves, aren't we becoming self-absorbed?
John said in trying to improve ourselves, Aren't we becoming self-absorbed? It's still about me. That's a good question. In improving ourselves, what we realize is that it's not about ourselves. So we're not improving ourselves because we want to be the best possible. We're improving ourselves because we want to do what's needed from us. Like we explained last week from the Alter Rebbe, or paraphrased by JFK. I don't know if he studied the teachings of the Alter Rebbe, but right, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So by asking what you can do for your country, it's not about you, it's about your country. By working on oneself to edge one's ego out, to it's not all about me. Yes, we're thinking about ourselves a lot, but on the flip side, we're doing it for the greater good. Excuse me. So it reminded me of another joke that I wanted to say, but then it slipped. All right. That's the first message that we take. The other message, the second message, not the other, the second, we got three. There is a powerful concept in Judaism, and it goes like this, right? What happens when we go to work? 9 o'clock in the morning, right? There's too many jokes today. There's an old Jewish saying that there's a Jewish tradition that a omen for wealth is to read the portion in the Torah that talks about the manna falling from heaven, right? Because everything falls from heaven. So a great Hasidic leader was once asked, what's your opinion about this good omen? Is that, is it valid, or is it just a superstition or something that, people like doing? Is it valid? Should I go ahead and do that and read it every day? He said it's a true, tried and tested good omen until 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock, close the book and get to work. So, right, what happens? You go to work. It's a long day. Some of us leave to work. I texted a guy, I'm trying to get him. I visit his office every Tuesday. And he doesn't live in Mar Vista. And so I'm trying to get him to bring his tefillin so we can have it checked. Because he's got his own good pair of tefillin and he hasn't checked it. So I texted him. I figured I'll text him early in the morning. I text him at 7 o'clock. He says, Rabbi, sorry, I left home already on my way to work. So I said, next week I have to plan on texting you at 5:30. All right. So what happens? We leave to work early in the morning and we go through a long day. Long day. When we come home 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock, and what happens? We got people at home, right? Spouses, children, family, and we are wiped. We're done. Especially a parent with small children, right? Come home at the end of the day and we're wiped. Says the Torah, when does the day begin? According to Torah, at night. You come home from work, you've just completed your day. You know what? Starting now, your new day. Take a deep breath. Forget about everything that happened yesterday. And now you walk into your home. This is the beginning, the start of a new day. And how do you feel at the start of a new day? Refreshed, invigorated, excited to take on a new day. That's what happens when you walk in through the front door. What do I mean by that? That Judaism says that the day starts the night before. Who remembers the narrative of creation that we read on the Torah portion of Bereshis? Right? How do we read the narrative of creation? Vayihi erev, vayihi voker. It was evening. It was day. Day one. It was evening. It was day. Second day. It was evening. Why always it was evening? It was day. What time does the day start? 12 a.m. morning. Right? Was it 1 in the morning? Not 1 at night. The night doesn't start. No, in Judaism, it doesn't work that way. When does Shabbos start? Not 12 a.m. Saturday morning. When does Shabbos start? Friday night, sunset. That's when the day begins, according to Torah. The day begins with nighttime. Counterintuitive. Shouldn't the day begin with bright light, excitement, a shining sun? Isn't that when the light begins, when the day begins? Says the Torah now, the day begins in darkness. What does darkness symbolize? Challenges in life. In life, the beginning of everything is always going to be obstacles. It's going to be challenges, right? And where does that stem from? The Tzimtzum. How did God create the world that you and I know? How did God create you and me? How did God create this entire world? Through darkness, through the Tzimtzum, through concealment. What happens following concealment? Light, creation, you and me. What we perceive as light. Obviously, what God perceives as light is the infinite light. But what we perceive as light is when we're born. That's when the party started, right? So there's always going to be a concealment. In life, if there's no concealment, you didn't start something new. What do I mean by that? The Talmud says a statement, Kol hascholes kashes, all beginnings are tough. If you start something new, you're working on a project, you're on a mission, what happens? Inevitably, you're going to hit snags. You're going to hit bumps. It's going to be challenging. It's going to be hard. Like, all right, I mentioned earlier about right at the beginning of the class, when in the face of adversity, we get adversity all the time. We start a new project. We start a new job. There's always going to be those bumps in the road. We start a relationship. In the beginning of the relationship, there's a lot of rocky points. Why is there those rocky points? Because it's hardwired into the system of the world. There's going to be a bumpy start. And when it's a bumpy start, you know that you've done a good start. And you know also that the light is ahead. And they say, why are New Yorkers so depressed? There's a light at the end of the tunnel in New Jersey. But I don't really understand the joke because New Jersey is actually beautiful. It's got lots of grass. And either way, so that's the idea of life. In life, we're always going to hit bumps. We're always going to hit snags. We're always going to hit challenges, especially when we're starting something new. The Rebbe once told someone that if you started something, who was complaining that he started a new project, a wonderful project, an important project, and it's really tough, and he wants to give up. And the Rebbe told him, if you told me that you started a new project and there were no challenges, then I tell you that you didn't start a project. Because if the Talmud says, right, and how does the system of the world work? What's it hardwired? That in the beginning of a project, there's got to be a concealment. There's got to be something tough. There's got to be darkness. If there's no darkness, that means you didn't start the day. And if there's no start of the day, then you're not going to have the light that comes after. You aren't using your full potential. How do you know you're using your full potential? When it hurts, when there's challenges, right? And you have that in life, in every area of life. We're coming to world's, right, the National Day of I'm going to go to the gym more celebration, right? New Year's. It's New Year's resolution. I'm going to go to the gym more. Like I said, I have a friend who started a new business. He said he's going to open a gym. It's going to be a gym for January, and from February through December, it's going to be a bar. All right. So what happens? We get this excitement. We start working out, and then we hit snags in the road. We hit challenges, scheduling, and then what happens? Most people, we give up. But you know when it's really rich? When we persevere. When we persevere through those initial challenges, you know what happens? Smooth sailing afterward. But those initial challenges are the toughest. They're the hardest. But you know what happens after darkness? Light. After it was evening, it was morning. Following evening, it's a guarantee morning will come. If you're doing weights and you're doing 4 pounds or 3 pounds or 2 pounds, yeah, your muscles are not going to hurt the next day because you know why? You're not using your full potential. If you start using greater lifts, heavier lifts, suddenly everything is hurting you. But you know what? If you continue doing that, it's going to stop hurting. And now you know what do you got to do? A new beginning. Move up to the next weight. Because no pain, no gain. Where does that statement come from? The Tzimtzum, the concealment. Without the concealment, it won't be the creation of the world. There had to be the concealment, and then came the creation of the world. The pain, the gain. And it's like that in everything in life. Let's have a look here in text 8a. 8a and 8b. Page 160. There was evening and there was morning one day. This verse informs us that there is no day without a light, without a night that precedes it. Why must it be so? Why does a day not exclusively consist of daylight hours or perhaps just the night hours? Why must it include both evening and morning? And why must night precede the day? Right? These are real philosophical questions. My guess is you've never asked yourself. Right? Sorry, another joke. Similar to the question, right? There's a great philosophical question. If a tree falls in the forest, no one's around to hear it, does it still make noise? Yeah. If the husband says something and his wife's not around, is he still wrong? So a whole genre of, philosophical questions. So here we have a question: why is the day structure the way it is? So continues the text on 160. The root of the matter is that at the source of creation there was evening before morning. That is, darkness preceded light. For the Tzimtzum preceded the sharing of God's kindness. This darkness-light combination extends to all the worlds, including our world, where night precedes day. That's the way we are hardwired. And if it doesn't work out that way, we're not using our full potential. Yes, John, you had a question?
Invigorated and come home after a long day. Because it's a new
Do I feel, I don't know, the question was, do I feel invigorated after coming home from a long day? I don't know, ask my kids. It's a question for them. My feelings are, how do they say? Feelings don't care about the facts. Facts don't care about feelings. The way I feel about it is different than the way my kids see it. So you got to add as a question for them. All right. Continue in text 8b, the same idea which we just expressed in the divine. Text 8b, this is from Rabbi Dov Lubavitch, who we discussed last week, his birthday and his yahrzeit and his anniversary of release from imprisonment, page 162. He continues, we observe the same pattern reflected in the fears of the world, whereby individuals do not achieve growth in wealth, leadership, building a family, study, or any other accomplishment without first experiencing humiliation, pain, loss, and the like. For example, individuals engaged in study will not arrive at a complete understanding of the subject without much toil and stress, feeling distant from understanding and tempted to despair from mastering the subject. Indeed, the Talmud states one does not understand statements of Torah without first being mistaken. We observe the same in earning a livelihood, whereby we succeed only after putting forth great effort and enduring much pain, even feeling despair. Only thereafter do we find profit and great blessing. This is the way that God's blessings flow in the upper worlds and travel down to the lowest realm. There is no light without the darkness that precedes it. As it is stated, according to the pain is the reward. So if you ever wanted to know the source of that adage of no pain, no gain, here it is. Tractate Avot from the Ethics of Our Fathers in the Talmud, according to the pain is the reward. Why? Because first comes darkness, then comes light. Which leads us to the third point, which is it's a hard point, especially in light of what's going on. But it's an important point, and for us to think about for ourselves, never to imply it on another person, to impose it on another person. We have tough things in life, some more tough than others. Challenges. We're not talking about minor challenges, even major challenges. But perhaps let's pick a minor challenge. If someone's, it's not really minor, it's major, but it's minor in the larger scheme of things, right? Someone gets fired from their job. Is that a good thing? I'll give another example. Jack is running to catch his flight, and because he's running on a cold 30-degree New York winter, he's running to make his cab to JFK. He slips on black ice, and he breaks his foot. And he's rushed to the airport. He's rushed to the hospital. Right? He breaks his foot. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? It's a bad thing, right? It's darkness. Then he finds out that plane hijacked, right? Thank God everyone made it out alive at the end of the story, right? I don't like the crash example because that's, I feel bad for the other people in my make-believe story, right? So it was hijacked, right? And 2 days later, they let it go. Now, was Jack breaking his foot a good thing or a bad thing? It was a wonderful thing. So it wasn't just a wonderful thing. It brought out something that would have never been there had it not happened. When we hit challenges in life, we should think about it for ourselves. Obviously, we pray to God these challenges shouldn't happen, but it's important to do our best. And it's counterintuitive and it's easier said than done, but to think about this idea that first comes darkness, then comes light. And unfortunately, we don't always see the light that follows the darkness. But the Torah guarantees us that the light is always there and it always follows. And perhaps what hits this idea home the most is a statement from the previous Rebbe, who we've quoted many, many times. Previous Rebbe had a very hard life. In 1920, his father passed away. He was 40 years old. 40. And he assumed the responsibility of Chabad. Now, what's the big deal? He's 40, he's not a young guy. And assuming the responsibility of Chabad, it's not that big. But in 1920, Chabad was headquartered in Russia, which had just been overthrown by the Bolshevik Revolution, who now brought into reality the idea that anyone who practices Judaism is going to be arrested and shot for counter-revolutionary measures. And it wasn't an empty threat. It was something that happened to thousands upon thousands of people, millions of people, but thousands upon thousands of Chabad followers. Many, many, many Chabad rabbis were killed at the communist firing squad. And so here's Rabbi Yosef Irgas, who assumes leadership of Chabad at this key moment in history. And he doesn't back down from his work. And he goes full throttle ahead in building mikvahs, ritual baths for the women to go to, and building Talmud Torahs for Jewish children. And at each step in the road, the communists are after him. They arrest him once, they arrest him twice, they arrest him 3 times, until they finally arrest him in 1927, and they give him the verdict of death by the firing squad. And miraculously, he gets saved, which is a story for another time, a story that I've shared a number of times. During his imprisonment, especially in 1927, he endured terrible, terrible beatings at the hands of the brutes, the communists. So much so that he went in 1927, a young man at 47 years old, as a healthy man, a strong man, and he came out weak, wheelchair-bound, contracted many, many sicknesses. And he was asked, was it worth it? And he said a very powerful line in text 9 on page 163. This is his own writing. If someone would offer to sell me a single moment of additional suffering for $1 billion, I would not buy it. If someone would offer to purchase a single moment of my past suffering for $1 billion, I would not sell. That is seeing the light in the dark. He understood the power that comes from it. I think there's a term for it there is a term for it in modern psychology, post-traumatic growth, right? Post-traumatic growth, it happens in different areas. And obviously it's not something we wish on anyone. Post-traumatic growth, we don't wish trauma on anyone, God forbid. But if it does happen, small traumas, larger traumas, this idea, it's the darkness before the light. It's the Tzimtzum that enables creation of the world. And so if there's something that we would take from this idea, it's perhaps most important, I feel, is the idea of these 3 lessons of what the Tzimtzum is. Tzimtzum is a concealment of ourselves, which enables space for others, which is really what happened with God. It was the infinite light, and it enabled space for something to perceive itself as an other outside of God, the worlds of formation, emanation, creation, formation, and action, right, up until us, and for us to reciprocate that to God and to put our ego aside and make space for God. And to always remember that darkness is always immediately followed by bright light. And so in life, when we hit snags, when we hit challenges, It's not a sign from heaven that I should stop doing what I'm doing. On the contrary, that's a sign that I should push forward, because it's going to get the darkest just before light. And once I push forward, I'm going to reach the moment of light. So we'll conclude with the lesson video, and then we'll continue with some discussion. Here we go.
Lesson 5. The Great Concealment. 1. The human tendency for self-absorption leads one to deny others the space to express themselves. It is essential to utilize the power of personal Tzimtzum to not needlessly impose ourselves upon the rightful domain of others. This is primarily accomplished through avoda, the work of enhancing one's character. 2. Pondering the extent to which God exercised Tzimtzum out of His love for us can inspire us to intentionally create space for God in our daily lives. 3. The path to success is frequently obscured by hardship. To achieve our aspirations, it is essential to realize that the drawbacks are steps toward success.